A golden retriever was biting a coyote's tail in the snow. "What kind of madness is this?" the distant neighbors thought. But the dog wouldn't let go, pulling the wild animal towards the silent house. When they discovered what lay inside that residence, they understood they were witnessing the greatest act of love of their lives. Before we begin today's story, tell me where you're watching from. Take this opportunity to grab some coffee or settle into your couch. And please don't forget to support us. All you need to do is click like, and I'll know you enjoy this type of story. Ready? Let's begin. The morning arrived with a dense fog that covered the fields like a grey blanket. Max awoke in his favorite spot on the porch, stretching slowly. Something felt different. The silence of the house was too profound, too absolute. Normally, by this hour, he would already hear his owner's familiar footsteps moving through the kitchen, the sound of the kettle on the stove, perhaps a morning cough. But today, there was only silence. The golden retriever stood up, wagging his tail with less vigor than usual. A strange feeling tightened his chest, something he couldn't name, but that made his most primitive instincts stir. He walked to the kitchen door and scratched the wood softly. "Arthur?" The name didn't come out, just a low whine that echoed on the empty porch. He waited. Nothing. He circled the house, checking each window with his nose pressed against the cold glass. In the living room, the old man's favorite armchair was empty, with only a folded blanket on its arm. In the kitchen, the previous night's coffee cup remained untouched on the sink. But it was when he reached the basement window that Max felt his world crumble. Down below, on the cold concrete floor, lay Arthur, motionless. One leg at an awkward angle, his face as pale as the snow that was beginning to fall outside. Max started to bark, loudly, desperately, a sound that cut through the morning air like a siren. He ran to the front door, then to the back, then to the dirt road that connected the property to the outside world. But the road was empty. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away. How could a dog explain that his best friend was dying? Despair took hold of him in a way he had never experienced. He ran in circles, barking at the sky, at the trees, at anything that might hear. But only the wind answered, whispering through the bare branches. That's when he saw movement at the tree line. A cautious shadow emerged from the forest. Elongated snout, grayish fur, pointed ears always alert. A coyote. The wild animal stopped about 20 yards away, observing the domestic dog with curiosity mixed with suspicion. Normally, Max would have growled, defending his territory. Normally, the coyote would have fled at the first sign of human or canine presence, but nothing about that morning was normal. The golden retriever looked at the coyote, then at the house, then back at the wild animal. A crazy idea began to form in his canine mind. He wasn't sure if it would work, wasn't sure if it made sense, but it was the only chance he had. He began to approach the coyote slowly, emitting low, non-threatening sounds. The wild animal backed away a few steps, but didn't flee completely. There was something about the domestic dog's behavior that was different. It wasn't aggression, it wasn't playfulness, it was something deeper, more urgent. When Max got within a few yards, he did something that surprised them both. In a quick but careful motion, he gently took the coyote's tail between his teeth. Not to hurt, but to communicate, to ask for help in the only way he knew how. The coyote turned, confused, trying to understand what the dog wanted. Max began to pull gently, guiding the wild animal toward the house. His eyes were filled with an urgency that transcended the barrier between species. The coyote resisted for a moment, its instinct screaming to flee from this bizarre situation. But something in the golden retriever's gaze made it hesitate. There was desperation there, but also trust, as if the dog was saying, "I need you. I don't know how to explain, but I need you." Djinn, and for the first time in its wild life, the coyote decided to trust a domestic dog. The coyote allowed itself to be guided, its alert senses picking up something that Max couldn't yet fully express. There was a scent in the air, subtle but unmistakable to a nose trained by survival in the wild. The scent of fear, of pain, of human vulnerability. When they reached the house, Max released the coyote's tail and ran to the basement window. He began to scratch the glass frantically, alternating between sharp yelps and deeper barks. The coyote cautiously approached, its snout lightly touching the cold glass. And then it saw the elderly man on the basement floor, motionless, his breathing so faint it was almost imperceptible. The coyote had seen death before, had smelled the end of life approaching wounded prey, but this time it was different. This wasn't a natural cycle of the forest. This was a life that could still be saved. Max looked at the coyote with an intensity that cut through millions of years of separate evolution. In that moment, they were not predator and competitor, not wild and domestic. They were just two beings who understood the value of a life. The golden retriever started running again towards the road, stopping every few yards to make sure the coyote was following. He had a plan, even if he didn't know exactly how to explain it. He needed to find people, he needed to find help, and somehow this wild animal would be his voice. The coyote hesitated at the edge of the property. Its wild nature warned it against venturing too far from the safety of the forest. But the domestic dog's pleading gaze made it continue. There was something bigger happening there, something its ancestral instinct recognized as important. They walked down the dirt road, an unlikely pair, leaving paw prints in the snow that was beginning to accumulate. Max led with determination, stopping occasionally to ensure his improbable companion was still following. The coyote maintained a respectful distance, but remained committed to the journey. After nearly an hour of walking, they saw smoke rising from a chimney in the distance. The property of the nearest neighbors, the Morrisons, a family that had lived there for decades. Max quickened his pace, his energy renewed by hope. But as they approached the house, the coyote stopped abruptly. Its survival instincts finally prevailed over momentary compassion. People meant danger, they meant weapons, they meant death for its kind. Max turned, realizing he was losing his only ally. He ran back to the coyote, once again gently grabbing its tail. This time, however, his actions were different. He wasn't pulling the wild animal. He was saying goodbye. The golden retriever pressed his muzzle against the coyote's for a brief moment, a gesture of gratitude that needed no translation. The coyote understood. It had brought the domestic dog this far. It had fulfilled its part of the impossible bargain. With a final look, the coyote retreated into the safety of the trees, watching from a distance as Max ran towards the Morrisons' house. The dog began to bark with all the strength of his lungs, scratching at the front door, running in circles in the yard. It was the kind of behavior that would normally result in a scolding, but there was something different in the urgency of his movements. Sarah Morrison opened the door, her expression shifting from annoyance to concern as she saw the animal's desperate state. "Max? What are you doing here, boy? Where's Arthur?" The golden retriever ran a few steps towards the road, then back, repeating the movement several times. His eyes begged her to understand, to follow his lead. Sarah had known animals long enough to recognize when something was terribly wrong. "Tom!" Sarah yelled into the house, her voice laced with urgency. "Get out here, quick!" Tom Morrison appeared at the door, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. In his 60s, he was a practical man who had learned to trust nature's signs as much as any modern technology. "Look at Max," Sarah said, pointing to the dog, who continued his frantic behavior. "Something's happened to Arthur." Max ran up to Tom, pressing his body against the man's legs, then back towards the road. His whines had an almost human tone of pleading. Never seen him like this, Tom muttered, grabbing his car keys and a heavy coat. Sarah, call emergency services. Tell them we're going to check on Arthur Henderson, and they might need to send an ambulance. As Sarah hurried to the phone, Tom followed Max to the pickup truck. The golden retriever jumped into the truck bed without hesitation, something he normally wouldn't do. His strict upbringing had been temporarily suspended by the urgency of the situation. During the 5-minute drive to Arthur's property, Max didn't stop moving in the truck bed, alternating between looking at the road ahead and at Tom through the rear window. His eyes conveyed a clear message: "Faster, please, faster!" When they arrived at the house, Max leaped from the truck before it had even come to a complete stop. He ran directly to the basement window, repeating the same desperate movements as before. Tom followed him, and when he looked through the window, his blood ran cold. "My God," he whispered, already running to find an entrance to the basement. Arthur had been unconscious for hours. His body temperature had dropped dangerously, and his fractured leg showed signs that the fall had been violent. But he was still breathing. There was still time. Tom used his cell phone to call emergency services directly, explaining the situation while searching for a spare key he knew Arthur kept hidden. "He's alive, but in critical condition," he reported to the dispatcher. "Severe fall, possible hypothermia, leg clearly fractured. How long until the ambulance gets here?" 20 minutes at least, sir, due to the rural location." 20 minutes that could mean the difference between life and death. Tom found the key and rushed to the basement. Arthur was cold to the touch, his breathing shallow and irregular. But as Tom knelt beside him, the old man opened his eyes for a brief moment. "Max," was all he managed to whisper before collapsing again. "He's here, Arthur. He brought help," Tom said softly, covering the old man with his own coat. Outside, Max had stopped barking. As if he knew his mission had been accomplished, he now just waited, lying near the basement window, watching over his owner through the glass. But something else was watching too. In the trees surrounding the property, a grayish silhouette observed the activity. The coyote hadn't completely left. Something kept it there, a primal need to see the end of the story it had helped write. When the sound of ambulance sirens finally echoed across the fields, the coyote gave one last look at the house where a man was being saved thanks to an impossible alliance between species. And then, silently, it disappeared back into the forest, taking with it the certainty that it had participated in something far greater than mere survival. Max raised his head at the sound of the sirens, his tail wagging weakly. He had done it. Against all odds, he had saved his best friend. The paramedics worked with silent efficiency in the basement, their professional voices contrasting with the tension that hung in the cold air. Arthur was stable, but critical. The hypothermia had been controlled in time, but the fractured leg would require immediate surgery. "How did you find out he was here?" one of the paramedics asked as they prepared Arthur for transport. Tom looked at Max, who hadn't moved an inch from the makeshift gurney. It was his dog. Came to our house practically begging for help. "Lucky break," the paramedic commented. "A few more hours in this cold and..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood. As they carried Arthur to the ambulance, Max tried to follow, but was gently held back. "Easy, boy," Tom said, stroking the golden retriever's head. "You did your part. Now let the humans take care of him." But Max wasn't satisfied. His eyes followed every movement of the ambulance until it disappeared down the dusty road. Then he simply lay down in the exact spot where the vehicle had been, as if he could guard the space until Arthur returned. "He can stay with us until Arthur recovers," Sarah offered, having arrived shortly after the ambulance. Max raised his head, considering the offer, but then lowered it again. No. His place was there, guarding the house, waiting. It was his responsibility. Tom and Sarah exchanged glances, recognizing the animal's unwavering determination. They brought water, food, and an old blanket, setting up a temporary shelter on the porch. "At least he'll be dry here," Sarah said, watching Max settle into the spot that allowed him to see both the road and the house entrance. In the following weeks, a routine was established. Every day, one of the Morrisons would come to check on Max, bringing fresh food and company. The dog accepted the care with silent gratitude, but never abandoned his post. It was during one of these morning visits that Tom noticed something strange. Paw prints in the snow around the porch. They weren't Max's, nor were they human. They were coyote paw prints, multiple prints, as if the wild animal had circled the house during the night. "Sarah," Tom called, pointing to the marks in the snow. "Look at this." She examined the prints with growing interest. "Looks like Max has a secret guardian." As if summoned by their conversation, movement at the tree line caught both their attention. There it was, the coyote, observing the house from a distance, its intelligent eyes focused on the porch where Max rested. "Do you think it's the same animal Max found that day?" Sarah whispered. Tom nodded slowly. "Animals are smarter than we give them credit for. Maybe it understands it's part of this story." Max had noticed the coyote's presence too. But instead of barking or showing territoriality, he simply lifted his head in a silent greeting. It was as if the two had established an understanding that transcended human logic. The coyote remained at a respectful distance, but its visits became regular, always at dusk, always watching, always guarding. It was as if it had taken on a shared responsibility for the property's safety until its resident returned. One night, during a particularly strong storm, Tom arrived for his morning check and found something extraordinary. Max was dry and warm in his makeshift bed on the porch, but there were clear signs he hadn't been alone during the storm. Coyote prints led directly to the porch and then away. In the snow, Tom could see where the wild animal had lain, creating a natural windbreak that protected Max from the worst of the blizzard. "They're looking out for each other," Tom murmured to himself, marveling at the complexity of the friendship he had witnessed. Max looked at him as if he could read his thoughts, then directed his gaze toward the forest where he knew his unlikely protector rested during the day. Two different species, united by an experience that had forever changed how they saw the world around them. 3 weeks after the rescue, Tom received a call he had been eagerly awaiting. "He's doing well," Arthur's cheerful voice said from the other end of the line. "The doctors say I can come home tomorrow. My leg is healing better than they expected." Tom smiled, looking out the window to where Max kept his daily vigil. "There's someone here who will be very happy to hear that." "How is he?" Arthur's voice filled with emotion. "Max, he saved my life, didn't he?" "More than you can imagine," Tom replied, "and in a way you'll never believe." The next day, Tom and Sarah helped Arthur out of the car, supporting him as he maneuvered with his crutches. Max had sensed the arrival long before the vehicle entered the property. His ears were perked, his body trembling with anticipation. When Arthur finally appeared, leaning on his crutches but smiling, Max couldn't contain himself. He ran to meet his owner, carefully avoiding the crutches, but pressing his body against the old man's healthy legs with an intensity that spoke louder than 1,000 words. "My boy," Arthur whispered, his hands trembling as he stroked the golden fur. "My hero." Max was whimpering, that kind of canine cry that sounds almost human, a release of weeks of tension and worry. It was as if he could finally relax, knowing he had fulfilled his silent promise to guard the house until his owner's return. "Tom told me how you brought help," Arthur said, still petting Max, "but I want to hear the whole story." As they settled into the living room, Tom recounted the entire story, from Max's desperate discovery to the unlikely alliance with the coyote, to the weeks of shared vigil. Arthur listened in silence, his eyes filling with tears as he grasped the scope of what had happened. A coyote, he repeated, incredulous. Max asked a coyote for help. And there's more, Sarah said, pointing to the window. Look outside. At the tree line, like a silent guardian, stood the coyote. It had arrived shortly after Arthur's car, as if it knew this would be an important moment. Arthur got up with difficulty, leaning on his crutches, and walked to the window. The coyote didn't move, just watched the old man with those intelligent eyes that had already witnessed so much. He came to check if you were okay, Tom explained. He's been doing it every night since you went to the hospital. Arthur pressed his hand against the window pane, a gesture of gratitude directed at the wild animal that had helped save his life. For a moment, man and coyote gazed at each other through the glass, a silent communication passing between them. Max approached the window too, pressing his nose against the glass in the same spot where Arthur's hand rested. It was as if he were formally introducing his two saviors to each other. The coyote tilted its head slightly, a gesture that could have been interpreted as a greeting or a farewell. Then, with the silent grace characteristic of its species, it turned and began walking back into the forest. "Wait," Arthur said softly, though he knew the animal couldn't hear him through the glass. "Thank you." As if it had heard, the coyote paused for a moment, looked one last time at the house where three beings, two humans and a dog, watched it with gratitude, and then disappeared among the trees. "I think he knows his job here is done," Sarah said softly. Arthur nodded, his hand still on the window. "But I'll never forget what he did." Max moved away from the window, finally relaxed, and went to lie down in his favorite spot at the foot of Arthur's armchair, where he could keep vigil in a more normal and familiar way. The following days brought a new routine for Arthur and Max. The old man moved more slowly, dependent on his crutches, but there was a renewed energy in his movements. The near-death experience had fundamentally changed something in his perspective on life. "You know, Max," Arthur said one morning as he carefully prepared coffee, "maybe this fall was a blessing in disguise." Max tilted his head, as he always did when Arthur spoke to him. It was an old habit between them. The old man shared his thoughts with the dog, as if he were an intimate friend, and Max always seemed to grasp the essence of his words. "It made me realize I'm not as alone as I thought," Arthur continued, placing two mugs on the table, one for him and a small bowl of water for Max, a morning ritual they had developed over the years. The truth was that Arthur had spent the last 3 years since his wife Martha's death gradually isolating himself from the world. The Morrisons were good neighbors, but he had systematically refused their invitations for dinners or social visits. He preferred Max's silent company and the solitude he felt he deserved in his old age. But almost dying alone in the basement had planted a seed of change in his heart. That afternoon, Arthur decided to take a walk around the property, something he hadn't done in months. With Max by his side, moving at a pace dictated by his crutches, he explored the corners of the farm he had neglected. It was during this walk that he noticed something peculiar. Near the spot where Max had encountered the coyote that fateful morning, there were clear signs that wild animals continued to visit the area, not just coyote tracks, but also those of other animals, foxes, raccoons, even marks that looked like a deer's. "Looks like you've made more friends," Arthur commented, watching Max sniff the tracks with interest. It was as if the property had become a meeting point for the local wildlife. Arthur wondered if his more reclusive presence in recent years had inadvertently created a refuge for the region's animals. That night, he decided to do something he hadn't done since Martha's death. He prepared an elaborate dinner, not just for himself, but he invited Tom and Sarah Morrison to share it. "To thank you for your help," he explained when he called them, "and to hear more about these weeks while I was gone." During dinner, stories flowed like wine. Sarah recounted the mornings when she found Max perfectly dry on the porch, despite the previous night's rain, clear signs that his wild protector had created shelter for him. Tom described the nights he returned late from work and saw two pairs of eyes reflecting his headlights, one golden, one wild yellow, both watching over the property together. "It's like they've established a partnership," Tom said, cutting a piece of pie Sarah had brought for dessert, "one that goes beyond anything I've ever seen between animals." Arthur listened to every word with growing fascination. "Do you think he's still around?" "I'm sure of it," Sarah replied. "I saw fresh tracks in the snow this morning." After their neighbors left, Arthur sat in his favorite armchair with Max lying at his feet. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. There was a sense of community, of connection that extended beyond the walls of the house to the surrounding forest. "You changed everything, didn't you, boy?" he whispered to Max, who responded with a contented sigh. Outside, in the darkness, Arthur was sure they weren't completely alone. Somewhere among the trees, a wild guardian kept its silent vigil. A week after dinner with the Morrisons, Arthur woke up earlier than usual. It was one of those winter mornings when the snow had stopped falling overnight, leaving the world covered in a perfect, untouched blanket of white. Through his bedroom window, he could see the rising sun painting the landscape with golden hues. Max had also woken up early, restless in a way Arthur couldn't identify. The dog paced back and forth from the front door, looking at his owner with an expression that seemed to say, "You need to see this." Curious, Arthur dressed carefully, grabbed his crutches, and followed Max to the porch. What he saw outside left him speechless. In the yard, clearly visible in the fresh snow, were tracks. Many tracks. Not just from the coyote he already knew, but from several different animals. It was as if, overnight, his property had transformed into a gathering of local wildlife. "My God," Arthur whispered, gripping his crutches for balance as he tried to process the scene. Max descended the porch steps and began to sniff the tracks, his tail wagging with restrained excitement. There was no tension in his movements, only curiosity and something that seemed like recognition. Arthur watched, fascinated, as Max followed a specific trail of tracks that led from the porch to a spot near the bird feeders Martha had installed years ago, but which he had neglected since her death. It was then that Arthur noticed something extraordinary. The feeders weren't empty, as they should have been after months of neglect. Someone, or something, had put food in them. Not just birdseed, but also some pieces of fruit that seemed to have been carefully arranged. "This doesn't make sense," Arthur murmured to himself, carefully maneuvering with his crutches to approach the feeders. That's when he saw movement at the tree line. First it was just a shadow, then two, and then several. Animals cautiously emerged from the forest, not just the familiar coyote, but also a fox with bright red fur, two raccoons who seemed to have completely lost their fear of humans, and even a young deer watching the scene with large dark eyes. Max didn't bark, didn't show any sign of aggression. Instead, he sat calmly in the snow, as if presiding over a very important meeting. Arthur understood then what was happening. Somehow, the rescue story that had connected Max to the coyote had spread through the silent network of communication that existed among wild animals. His property had become not just a refuge, but a symbol of something greater. "They know," Arthur whispered, tears freezing on his cheeks. "They know what happened here." The coyote took a step forward, separating itself from the group. Arthur immediately recognized those intelligent eyes that had watched his recovery through the window. For a long moment, man and wild animal gazed at each other across the distance that separated them. Then, slowly, the coyote approached the nearest feeder, not to eat but to deposit something it carried in its mouth. Arthur had to blink several times to be sure of what he was seeing. It was a small stick, perfectly straight, the kind that could be used as an improvised walking stick. The coyote placed the stick on the ground near Arthur's feet, then stepped back a few paces and tilted its head, the same farewell gesture it had made through the living room window. Arthur bent down carefully, balancing on his crutches, and picked up the stick. It was solid, the perfect height, as if it had been selected specifically for him. "Thank you," he said aloud, his voice echoing through the silent yard. The coyote tilted its head once more, then turned and walked back into the forest. The other animals followed one by one, until only Arthur, Max, and the golden morning remained. But the tracks in the snow told a story that would remain forever. In the days following the morning animal gathering, Arthur felt a profound transformation happening within him. The stick the coyote had brought became more than just physical support. It was a tangible symbol of the connection that had formed between him and the natural world around him. He began using the stick along with just one crutch, discovering that the combination gave him more stability and freedom of movement. It was as if the coyote's gift had been precisely calculated for his specific needs. Max observed these changes with obvious interest. There was something different about his owner's energy, a vitality he hadn't seen in years. Arthur walked more, smiled more, and more importantly, had begun to talk about the future instead of just surviving the present. "You know what, Max?" Arthur said one afternoon as he organized tools in the shed for the first time since the accident. "I think it's time we got those feeders working properly." The idea had grown in his mind all week. If his property had naturally become a refuge for local wildlife, why not make it official? Why not create a space where wild and domestic animals could coexist in harmony? With Tom Morrison's help, Arthur began a project that filled him with purpose for the first time in years. They built larger, more weather-resistant feeders, installed water sources that wouldn't freeze in winter, and created small shelters in strategic points on the property. "Martha would have loved this," Arthur commented as they worked, referring to his late wife for the first time without it bringing only sadness. "She's watching," Tom replied simply, and Arthur knew he was right. The real surprise came when Sarah suggested they document what was happening. "Have you thought about contacting the Regional Wildlife Center? They'd love to know about this community that's formed here." Arthur hesitated at first. His reclusive nature resisted the idea of drawing external attention to what he considered a very personal and intimate phenomenon. But Max seemed to approve of the idea. His tail wagged energetically when Sarah mentioned the possibility of more people knowing the story. "Maybe it's a good idea," Arthur finally agreed, "if it can help other animals or inspire other people to create safe spaces." The first visit from the Wildlife Center took place on a sunny late winter morning. Dr. Elena Ramirez, a biologist specializing in animal behavior, arrived with discreet observation equipment and palpable scientific curiosity. "In 20 years of my career, I've never seen anything like what you've described," she said, adjusting a long-range camera near the living room window. Arthur told the whole story, from the rescue to the formation of the animal community. Dr. Ramirez listened with growing fascination, occasionally asking detailed questions about specific behaviors she had observed. "What impresses me the most," she said finally, "isn't just the initial alliance between Max and the coyote, but how that experience created a ripple effect through the local animal community. It's as if they've recognized this property as a safe space." As they spoke, as if summoned by the conversation, animals began to appear at the forest's edge. First the familiar coyote, then the red fox, then the raccoons. It was as if they knew there was a special visitor and wanted to be part of the introduction. Max positioned himself on the porch, watching his wild friends with obvious pride. Dr. Ramirez remained silent for several minutes, simply observing the peaceful interaction among all species. "Arthur," she said finally, "you've created something very special here. This is more than a refuge. It's a living demonstration that harmonious coexistence between humans and wildlife is not only possible, but natural when based on mutual respect. Arthur looked at Max, then at the animals in the forest, then at the stick the coyote had given him. "I didn't create it," he said softly. "I just allowed it to happen." 6 months after the accident that changed everything, Arthur stood on the porch without crutches, supported only by the special stick that had become a permanent part of his life. Spring had arrived in full force, transforming his property into a vibrant garden that Martha would have adored. The refuge project had grown beyond his most optimistic expectations. With the help of the Wildlife Center and donations from community members who had heard the story, Arthur now maintained a formal feeding area, clean water stations, and even a small information center where visitors could learn about the local wildlife. But what proudest him most were not the physical structures, it was the community that had blossomed. Max had become something of an ambassador between species. Every day, in the early morning and late afternoon, he led what Arthur had come to call peace assemblies, moments when domestic and wild animals shared the same space in absolute harmony. The original coyote, whom Arthur had discreetly nicknamed Guardian, still made regular appearances. But now it brought company, a female and 2 pups born that spring. The young coyotes showed a curiosity about Max that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. "It's as if they're learning a new way of existing," Dr. Ramirez observed during one of her regular documentation visits. "The pups are growing up without the instinctive fear of domestic dogs that would be normal for their species." Arthur nodded, watching one of the coyote pups play near Max, not together but in parallel, respecting species differences but sharing the same space with trust. The story had spread beyond the local community. Journalists came to document the impossible friendship refuge, as a nature blog had dubbed the place. Schools brought field trips so children could see firsthand that peaceful coexistence was possible. But for Arthur, the most precious moments were still the quiet ones, when he sat on the porch at the end of the day, with Max at his side, watching Guardian and his family emerge from the forest for their evening meal. "Do you know what I've learned from all this?" Arthur said to Max on one of those golden afternoons, the stick resting against his knees. Max tilted his head with the same attention he always gave his owner's conversations. "I've learned that isolation isn't protection. It's a prison," Arthur continued, his voice filled with a wisdom born of lived experience. "When we build walls to keep ourselves safe, we end up trapping ourselves too." As if responding to his reflection, Guardian appeared at the edge of the forest, his pups playing near him. The adult coyote gave his usual greeting in the direction of the porch, a slight nod that Arthur always returned. "And I've learned that kindness is the universal language," Arthur added. "It doesn't matter if you have 2 legs or 4, if you're wild or domestic, everyone understands kindness." Max got up and walked to the edge of the porch, offering his own daily greeting to the visitors from the forest. It was a ritual that had developed naturally, a form of mutual recognition that transcended species barriers. That night, after the wild visitors had returned to the forest and Max had settled into his favorite bed, Arthur picked up a notebook he had begun using to document his daily observations. "Day 180 after the rescue," he wrote in his careful handwriting. "Today I realized that the true miracle wasn't Max saving my life that terrible day. The true miracle was how that experience saved all of us, not just me, but Max, Guardian, this entire unlikely community that has grown around us." He stopped writing and looked out the window at the moonlit property. Somewhere out there, he knew Guardian kept his nightly vigil, protecting not only his own family, but the entire expanded community they had created together. "The true miracle," he finally wrote, "was discovering that we were never truly alone." Exactly 1 year after that frigid morning that changed everything, Arthur woke to the familiar sound of Max moving restlessly around the house. But this time, the restlessness was different. It was excitement, anticipation, as if the dog knew that this day would be special. Arthur dressed carefully, grabbed his stick, which was now more of a walking companion than a medical necessity, and followed Max to the porch. What he found outside made his heart warm with a gratitude that seemed to grow with each passing day. The yard was full, not just with the regular visitors, Guardian and his family, the red fox who had been nicknamed Rusty, the raccoons who seemed to have permanently adopted the feeders as their personal dining hall. There were new faces too. A second pair of coyotes with their own pups, several families of squirrels, birds of species Arthur had never seen on the property before. It was as if the word had spread through the invisible animal network. This was a safe place, a place where different species could coexist in peace. Max descended the porch steps with the dignity of an experienced ambassador, greeting each group of animals with his calm, friendly presence. Arthur watched with admiration as his dog had transformed from an ordinary golden retriever into something much more special, a mediator between worlds. "Good morning, everyone," Arthur said softly, his voice carrying the tranquility he had learned to cultivate. "Thank you for coming to celebrate with us." Guardian approached closer than usual, his now-grown pups following him with confidence. For a moment that lasted an eternity, man and coyote gazed at each other, no longer strangers united by a crisis, but old friends who shared a unique story. Tom and Sarah Morrison arrived shortly after, bringing a celebratory cake and cameras to document the moment. Dr. Ramirez was also there, along with a small team from the Wildlife Center that had become an official partner of the refuge. "A year ago, who would have imagined this?" Tom said, observing the peaceful scene with renewed admiration. "Max imagined it," Arthur replied simply. He always knew it was possible. Throughout the morning, visitors arrived in small groups, neighbors who had heard the story, families with curious children, biology students fascinated by the project. But the wild animals did not flee. It was as if they understood that this was a day of celebration, a moment to show the world that coexistence was not only possible, but beautiful. One of the visiting children, a girl perhaps 8 years old, approached Arthur with wide, curious eyes. "Sir, is it true that the dog asked a wolf for help?" Arthur smiled, carefully kneeling to be at the child's level. "A coyote, dear. And yes, it's true. Max taught me that when we need help, we shouldn't be afraid to ask. And when someone asks for our help, we should try to respond, no matter how different we are." The girl nodded seriously, then looked at Max with obvious admiration. "He's a hero." "They all are heroes," Arthur corrected gently, gesturing to include the entire animal community around them. Each of them chose to be kind when they could have been indifferent. They chose to help when they could have passed by. Later that afternoon, after the human visitors had left and only the animal community remained, Arthur sat in his favorite chair on the porch. Max was at his feet. Guardian rested near the tree line, and the sense of completeness that hung over the property was almost tangible. Arthur picked up his notebook and wrote the final entry of his first-year journal. Today, 1 year after almost dying alone in the basement, I realized something important. We weren't just saved on the day of the accident. We've been saved every day since. Saved from loneliness, from fear, from the belief that we are too different to understand each other. Max taught me that love knows no species boundaries, that compassion is the language we all speak fluently, and that we are never truly alone when we open our hearts to the world around us. He closed the notebook and looked out at Max. "Thank you, my friend. Thank you for reminding me how to live." Max responded with that canine smile Arthur knew so well, his tail wagging gently against the wooden porch floor. And somewhere in the forest, Guardian howled once, not a howl of loneliness, but of community, of belonging. of a family that transcended all traditional definitions. If you've made it this far, it's because you believe in the power of stories that remind us of the goodness that exists in the world. Tell us in the comments, what animal do you believe could save your life? And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who also needs to be reminded that we are never truly alone. Until the next story.